The number of people forcefully displaced has continued to rise over the last 10 years and is now reaching 80 million. To make matters even worse, the COVID-19 pandemic has sparked a crisis of global magnitude. An infodemic, a word coined by the WHO, has become a buzzword. These culminating crises have further aggravated the refugee situation. In 2020, more than ever, reliable, unbiased information can save lives.
Hello and a warm welcome to DW Akademie's first virtual conference on communication and information in displacement settings. My name is Wanjikumwara.
And I am Eddie Micah Jr. It's always great to have you with us. Hello guys, can you believe that week 1 is done and we're already in the second and final week of this virtual conference? It's been a roller coaster altogether till now, and so much has already happened.
That's right, Eddie, but also there is still so much more to come. So let's dive right into it.
Well, if we're diving, then let's definitely do that. Today we'll be traveling to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we are meeting Lena Becker, who works as the Associate Reporting Officer for UNHCR. That's at the Bunia office. Now, UNHCR has a community-based protection approach centered around protection groups in which IDPs and members of the host communities participate. Now, those communities will share their experience with us.
How we do it. As usual, we'll have a Q&A session at the end in which we ask you to interact. So don't be shy to ask Lena and her team anything and make use of our conference app. We won't keep you waiting. Lena and her team are ready. Over to you, Lena.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be giving this presentation. I just wanted to say that I'm not alone in this. I'm together with my colleague, Rebecca Liron, who's an Associate Protection Officer for Community-Based Protection, who's based in South Kivu. And unfortunately, our other colleague, Jean-Mick Dhembu, who is a Senior Protection Associate based in Goma in North Kivu, cannot join us, but he really is like the lead on community-based protection here in the Eastern DRC, and he really has helped us also to get this presentation here together. So I just wanted to give a shout out to both of them as well. Right, so as you said, let's dive straight in. I'll start first to give you maybe a bit of an overview of what community-based protection means here for UNHCR, how this is linked to communication with communities, and then we'll really get into the active part of how this is implemented here in Eastern DRC. So as you can see on the next slide, we have a short overview of community-based protection. The goal of community-based protection really is to empower communities to have a leading role in humanitarian response and also in all of the protection aspects of humanitarian response. And this really means that we're working together directly with communities. As you have mentioned already, we work together with community-based groups. Those are associations and members of the community that get together, that organize themselves. They are composed of, on the one hand, members of the host community, so members of communities that host IDPs, as well as IDPs themselves. What is really, really important is that those groups, they have not been founded by UNHCR. It's not us who come in and create them, but it's really the community itself, and then we're just giving technical support as UNHCR, as protection experts. Why is community-based protection so important and such an important basic approach to our work? It's because it really will help in the long term to create more stable communities, more resilient communities as well. And this is particularly important in a context such as the DRC, where we're dealing really with protracted crises, where people have been displaced for a really long time already. And right, as I said, the goal of community-based protection really is that IDPs and members of the host community are in control of their own lives and their own protection situation during displacement, during emergency, but also in the more long term in a sustainable way. How is this linked to communication? For that, please refer to the next slide. Here you can see that communication with communities is a really important pillar of community-based protection. And communication with communities means for us that communities really have access to timely, accurate, relevant, and reliable information as well. But it's not a one-way street. Communication with communities is a two-way street. It's supposed to be a dialogue. So on the one hand, this means that we as UNHCR provide information to communities that will then help them make decisions for themselves, and that on the other hand, communities report back to us, give us feedback so that we can learn from them. What is really important in this is that, you know, information is relevant not just to the community as a whole, but it's also relevant and accessible for different groups within the community. So this can be, for example, you know, we adapt our communication when we're talking to children. We adapt the information that we're sharing, whether we're sharing it with women or men, whether we share it with persons who have particular vulnerabilities. All this really is important to keep in mind for communication to be effective and accessible to everybody. Then the other part of the dialogue, of course, is the feedback and the response. This means not only that we're gathering, you know, suggestions from communities, that we ask them, what did you think of our intervention? We also open up complaint mechanisms so that really, in case anything has gone severely wrong, that we're informed of this, that we can take accountability for this, and that then we learn from this in the future to really adapt our response in the future and make sure that the point of view of communities is really respected and fully included in humanitarian response and protection response. On the next slide, you can see how we're doing this in the Eastern DRC a bit more concretely. As you can see, we have two pillars. The one part is what UNHCR is doing for community-based protection groups, and the other part is the activities of community-based protection groups themselves. To refer to what we're doing as UNHCR, overall it is, I think it can be summarized as technical assistance. We're supporting around 70 community-based groups in the 3 provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu. We work together with them to help them identify protection needs in the community. So for example, we design projects together with them and we help finance those projects. Those projects can be a lot of different things depending on the specific context of each community. This can, for example, be wells that we have constructed for access to water. This can also be the extension of schools so that we constructed an additional classroom to really make it possible for displaced children to participate in school and education. This can be the creation of community fields so that people can conduct agriculture, have access to livelihood opportunities. So this is something that we do together with communities. We evaluate the situation, we see what their needs are, and then we finance such a project and accompany them in it. We also, as UNHCR, provide assistance for advocacy efforts. This is really, really important. Communities doing local advocacy, for example, with local authorities, and we're helping to guide them in this, how to do this most effectively. In addition, what are the community-based groups doing themselves? What activities are they leading? One very important aspect I think that we're going to be talking about a bit more in detail throughout this presentation is information sharing and awareness raising. So they share information with community members on how to respond to protection incidents, how to reduce protection risks and in their own community. For this, they create also community protection plans to have a bit more of a long-term view, which again is something for which UNHCR is providing assistance and guidance. In addition, community-based groups are really the ones that lead local advocacy according to their needs. So this again can be a variety of different things. For example, we've seen community-based groups that advocate with local authorities to improve the road conditions in the area so that traffic accidents, especially accidents involving children, can be reduced. We have also seen advocacy efforts, for example, to help free persons that have been arbitrarily detained, because this is often something that the community is aware of much sooner than humanitarian actors who sometimes are a bit further away, who are not in the local context every day. So this is really something where community-based groups have been taking the lead. On the next slide, just again, a point of general introduction in case, so that everybody can follow us. What is the IDP situation like in the Eastern DRC? What are we actually talking about? What is our context? We currently have almost 4.5 million IDPs in the 3 provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, South Kivu. Those numbers fluctuate. Unfortunately, they've been on a steep rise ever since, well, mid last year. The majority of those persons that are displaced in this, what we call cyclical displacement. So this means oftentimes persons are displaced more than once. Oftentimes persons that are now members of the host community have been IDPs before and now are taking in IDPs, but they might be displaced again in the future. The reason for displacement is really conflict. So here we're not talking about environmental displacement, we're not talking about disaster displacement, we're really talking about conflict related displacement. Conflict is unfortunately caused by a variety of factors. As you can see, we have disputes and tensions over access to land and resources, which in turn creates inter-community violence. We also have armed groups that are really present here that are unfortunately increasing this even more. The majority of internally displaced persons here in DRC, they are staying with host communities. So they're not staying in, displacement sites as you might have seen them, that are like, the big images you often see, but they really stay scattered in the different areas, in host communities, in persons that are taking them in and that are providing for them. So we often see that communities are really the very first responders to internal displacement. And this is also why our community-based protection approach is so important and relevant for this context, because we really support communities in being able to respond to displacement and be the first responders. With this first introduction, I'll be handing over to Rebecca, who will tell you a bit more about the details of what UNHCR has been doing here in Eastern DRC. Thank you, and over to you, Rebecca.
Great. Thank you so much, Lena. Thank you, DW, for having us and for the great introduction. And on the next slide, I'll be talking a little bit about our communication with IDPs and their host communities via the community-based protection groups. So, this is something that is always extremely important to our community-based protection approach, is having this open communication line with the community-based protection groups. And especially, in our current context of COVID-19, where UNHCR and other humanitarian actors are not as easily available to go out into the field to see and interact with IDPs in certain locations, we've had to increase our communication. So we worked a lot with community-based protection groups to understand their needs, during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond in our areas of intervention in Eastern DRC. And we've done this through surveys, through individual interviews, and focus groups. At times when we weren't able to go there ourselves, we did so through telephone communication. So this really helped us kind of better understand the needs and wants of IDPs and their host community members. So on the next slide, I'll just go over some of the findings that we got out of the various evaluations that we did with community-based protection structures, especially those done during the COVID-19 pandemic when our in-person or normal communication lines were not as feasible. So we learned that the understanding of coronavirus amongst IDPs and their host communities was generally quite high. And we've seen a link to the information sharing that Lena mentioned that is done by community-based protection groups, those that are supported by UNHCR. Because the people that we interviewed or had focus groups with really cited the work of community-based protection groups, as well as our implementing partners and radios, for example, as really important sources of information on COVID-19 for them during this time. And the evaluations that we did, just as a note, were done after the IDPs and host community members started doing these kind of mass information sharing activities in March of 2020, including radio broadcasts to get the message out about COVID-19 to their communities and IDPs. So on the next slide, I'll continue to talk about some of our findings from these evaluations with community-based groups. So the IDPs and host community members expressed that they had a need for additional information on kind of what's going on. I think that's a global need at this time. Everyone's in need of more accurate information, and the IDPs and their community members expressed the same thing. They also expressed needs for more prevention materials like hand washing stations, masks, things like that. And their kind of overall statement was that they themselves are not ready to respond 100% to COVID-19 if the cases do come. So they did express that they wanted humanitarian support from UNHCR and other humanitarian actors. So that was a really important affirmation for us that our interventions are wanted and needed. So on the next slide, I'll continue to talk about the findings from these evaluations. After speaking with host community members and IDPs, we learned that the perception of humanitarian workers remains generally positive. They did mention that if humanitarians are to intervene in areas where IDPs and these communities are, they want to see humanitarian workers respecting the measures that we're practicing, what we're preaching. So, wearing the mask, hand washing, and things like that. They want to see us, really taking these things seriously. Communities want humanitarian actors to support IDPs. So that was a bit about what I mentioned just before, that they are, expressing that they still want humanitarian actors to intervene in the areas where there are IDPs. The community-based protection groups communicated very specific recommendations, which was helpful for us, including advocacy to ensure that IDP and host community members can access their fields for work in a secure environment. So for example, if women have to travel farther to access their fields, making sure that they can do so in security and aren't at risk of sexual violence and exploitation, for example. So these community-based groups requested UNHCR and humanitarian actors to advocate with the Congolese government as well as the Congolese army to ensure that there are Congolese army posts in these specific areas. Another very specific recommendation that we appreciated was that we, enlarge or reconfigure one of the sites for IDPs in North Kivu so that they'll be less crowded and less at risk for COVID-19. to talk to you and show you some voices from the actual IDP and host community members themselves. Thank you.
Décidé de faire la sensibilisation sur le Covid-19 dans les milieux parce que nous voyons que c'est une pandémie qui a envahi tout le monde, que ce soit les États-Unis, que ce soit la France, l'Italie. Les grandes puissances que nous on considérait davantage sont aussi aujourd'hui en genoux devant le coronavirus et nous qui sommes ici de ces pays en voie de développement, c'est que si ça nous arrivait jusque dans les fins fonds du village, ça sera encore beaucoup pire que jamais. La sensibilisation dans la communauté, nous la faisons avec différentes méthodes. Soit nous parlons avec les gens en individuel, un individu, on échange avec lui sur la maladie, on lui parle de bouche à l'oreille. Nous avons également à faire la sensibilisation par des petits groupes d'individus, de 2 à 11 personnes. Nous faisons également la sensibilisation par des sketchs ou des théâtres que nous présentons dans des endroits publics, surtout avec en tenant compte du respect des normes édictées par les autorités de la santé, aussi les autorités politiques, pourvu qu'on n'aille pas à la contre de tout ce qui est prévu. Donc c'est ça ce que nous faisons dans le cadre de Corona. Mais en plus de ces sensibilisations en groupe, en focus group, nous faisons également la sensibilisation par la voie de mégaphones en circulant dans les quartiers par des animateurs, des mobilisateurs communautaires qui sensibilisent ça et là. Donc c'est pour ça que nous sommes en train de les faire à travers différents villages, les localités que nous avons dans notre contrée. Les difficultés que nous rencontrons, il y en a énormément, parmi lesquelles nous avons d'abord le manque de kits, de matériel de sensibilisation, nous n'en avons pas. Même ces mégaphones que nous utilisons, nous les prenons en location et ça nous coûte énormément. Nous n'avons pas assez d'argent comme nous fonctionnons par la contribution des membres, mais aussi des petits appuis de nos partenaires. En plus de ce matériel, je disais des mégaphones, nos mégaphones, des baffles qu'il n'y en a pas pour la sensibilisation. Nous avions également besoin de rétroprojecteurs pour des animations de conférences, des séminaires que nous organisons des fois. Nous avons en plus de cela, nous rencontrons des injures et la résistance de la communauté à accepter que la maladie, le corona, est une maladie réelle et qui existe effectivement. Mais finalement, par des exemples, ils finissent par comprendre que effectivement le corona existe.
Hello? Okay. Great. I'm sorry for this. So thank you very much. This was Pascal Baraka Udaga, who works as the president for one of the community-based groups that Unhcr is working with. The group is called Jude and is based in Chomia in Ituri province here in the eastern DRC. So as you can see on the next slide, he really explained to you how community-based protection groups work for information sharing and awareness raising. So even though this was only just one group, they all work according to a similar approach. So especially during COVID-19, but also before and also now on other topics, the awareness raising is conducted mostly by passing door to door, speaking with members of the communities, IDPs directly. They organize radio broadcasts on local community radio stations. They do small group sessions, or also pass through the villages really by megaphone to really spread the message to larger groups. So far, according to our evaluations, community-based groups in the 3 provinces of the Eastern DRC have been able to reach over 200,000 persons, including members of the host communities, including IDPs, with messaging on COVID-19 and how to prevent COVID-19, the spread of COVID-19. And this is really, really an important aspect, and it really, really helps us because community-based protection groups often go where UNHCR doesn't go, where UNHCR cannot go, where we're not present. So they really manage to spread awareness and raise awareness also in areas that humanitarian actors unfortunately cannot reach. So this is a really, really important support also for us. But of course, the work of community-based protection groups isn't just limited to awareness raising. We see a lot of great initiatives that they're taking on their own, especially during COVID-19, which is really a time that has brought all the communities together, but also before and after. So one of the best practices we really would like to highlight is that in some communities, the groups, they've gotten together to raise money so that they can install hand washing stations in their own communities. This is really a great initiative that we've been seeing. And now I would like to pass over to a second video from another community-based group, this time by Julienne Sgbvd, who is the president of a community-based group in Kaseni, also in Ituri province, who will talk a bit about other kind of work that community-based groups are doing and how they're important in helping us analyze protection risks in the communities. Let's pass to the video.
Quand nous faisons la sensibilisation dans la communauté, il y a des gens qui reçoivent bien la sensibilisation et qui se sont intéressés aussi à suivre la sensibilisation dans la communauté parce que c'est les risques qui sont arrivés dans notre communauté. Et par contre, ils écoutent, ils reçoivent ça très bien. Oui, quand nous faisons la sensibilisation dans la communauté, vous voyez, il y a aussi des difficultés qu'on trouve. Parfois, il y a des hommes qui ne sont pas aussi disponibles pour écouter notre sensibilisation parce que nous sommes les femmes, alors ils ne sont pas disponibles. Mais quand nous sommes avec les hommes, il y a des hommes qui sensibilisent les hommes et puis nous les femmes, nous sensibilisons les femmes, ça part très bien. Alors il y a aussi des difficultés qu'on trouve. Quand on fait la sensibilisation, on a essayé d'identifier les cas de mariage précoce par rapport au Covid-19. Pour le moment, on n'a pas l'école, on n'a pas l'église, raison pour laquelle les filles sont dispersées dans la communauté, ils sont en train de demander, ils sont devenus des mendiants, ils demandent quelque chose auprès des hommes, alors ils deviennent parfois les victimes de violences sexuelles.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Lena, and for the great voices from our community-based protection groups themselves, which is very important for our work and for you all to see. So on the next slide about risks of SGBV, I'll just highlight briefly, part of our community-based protection work includes the prevention of and response to sexual and gender-based violence. So the community-based protection groups alerted UNHCR to an increase in SGBV or sexual and gender-based violence during the outbreak of COVID 2019. And also, alerted us to some related prevention measures by the National Provincial Authority to sexual and gender-based violence. I'm hearing myself echo, but they're often the first point of contact for community members before even medical structures or police. So for example, if someone is a survivor of an incident of gender-based violence, they often go straight to one of the community-based protection groups supported by UNHCR. And the members of that community-based protection group include community members as well as IDPs will then refer that individual to the appropriate services. So whether that be to the closest medical center, or if they need, psychosocial support, things like that, to the relevant structure. So community-based protection structures are a super important source of information for UNHCR to evaluate trends in SGBV risk during the COVID-19 outbreak, when we're not as readily able to go to the field and otherwise. The biggest factor cited as an increase of risk for incidents of SGBV is the loss of income for families, and especially women who work in the informal sector with less job and income security. So some of the things that we've seen, with our increased communication with community-based groups during COVID-19, is an increase in child marriage and pregnancy amongst minors. This we have linked to girls not going to school, as schools were closed from March to September 2020. Parents not having the money that they did before COVID-19 to support their children as easily. An increase in sexual abuse and rape in general. For example, a frequent occurrence of this is when women are searching for firewood or going to the market or other fields that are a bit far from their home. We've seen survival sex, which is when women use sex to earn money as a means to survive. For example, to be able to afford products for feminine needs, like dignity kits. So these are just a couple of examples of the way that COVID-19 has affected women and girls proportionally. And also the pieces of information that we've learned through our communication lines with the community-based structures. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about stigmatization of IDPs in Eastern DRC. So why would IDPs be stigmatized? In general, this is because, well, it is a perception and also sometimes a reality that IDPs receive aid when some communities who are also in need do not. So for example, UNHCR may do a distribution for IDPs, but the community in the village next door will not have received this distribution, even though we do always try to include host community members. But that is the perception. We have also seen stigmatization against IDPs who are in actual physical sites. So as Lena mentioned earlier, most of the IDPs in Eastern DRC are housed in host community villages, whether in host families or just on their own in these villages. So it's quite rare that you'll see IDPs in Eastern DRC in actual sites. So we see those that are in sites in the province of North Kivu being stigmatized. And this stigmatization was increased by COVID-19. So as I mentioned, for the most part, most IDPs in Eastern DRC do not experience significant stigma because of the cyclical nature of displacement in Eastern DRC. Many of the folks who have been displaced have at once been host community members and vice versa. So many of those host community members have once been displaced. So there's, a level of understanding amongst these IDPs and their host communities. But there is stigma in certain cases, as I mentioned, such as the IDPs in the sites in North Kivu. So, this could always change. The level of stigma could always change. And we've seen that COVID-19 could be a factor of increasing stigma towards IDPs. For example, if there were to be, COVID cases in an area where there are IDPs, we could see increased stigma towards them as a means of kind of scapegoating. So the information sharing that community-based protection groups is doing is really crucial to continue to prevent stigmatization of IDPs. So on the next slide, we see that from our experience working on our community-based protection project and being in the field in Eastern DRC, The services provided by community-based protection groups reduce stigmatization of not only IDPs in general, but of all survivors of various protection incidents, whether that be children who are subjected to protection risks like joining armed groups or forced child labor, or women who have been women or boys who have been subjected to sexual and gender-based violence. So a statement of conclusion is that IDPs are a positive force for change. So together with their host community members, IDPs are given the tools to advocate with and for local authorities to ensure that IDPs have equal accesses to services and protection in their host areas. So the results that they achieve really benefit the entire community. So this is especially important for those IDPs living in sites in North Kivu, where they're proportionally more stigmatized. Some examples of this advocacy that benefits the entire community is that throughout Eastern DRC, community-based groups have been advocating to their health zone officials for more COVID-19 prevention measures and materials, which, of course, benefits the entire community in ensuring their health and safety. And they have also advocated to restrict mining companies from using child labor during this period of COVID-19, where children are more likely to try to find work in the mines because the schools are closed. So those are just some of the examples of the positive results of advocacy of these community-based groups. So community members and IDPs work together to share information on COVID-19 prevention measures. And lastly, humanitarian actors are not the face of the information sharing that the community-based groups are doing, nor for the advocacy. So this further reduces the risk that any stigma that there may be towards humanitarian actors is not transferred to IDPs. So community-based protection in Eastern DRC, what have we learned? We've learned what communities really want. So community-based groups provided very clear recommendations for how Unhcr can help them address protection and other concerns in their communities. We've learned that information prevents stigmatization. So IDPs contribute to communities by sharing information and advocacy. And lastly, we need to continue to approach the communities to better understand their wants and needs as the context of COVID-19 evolves and beyond that. So finally, community-based protection groups continue to play a leading role in their own lives and protection. And we as humanitarian actors are extremely grateful to them for all of the work that they do and all of the information that they provide us. So on the next slide, that's our closure and thank you slide. We thank you all for taking the time to listen to our presentation, to hear the voices of community-based protection groups that we work with. And we are now available to answer any questions. We're really looking forward to engaging with you all and having an active dialogue. So thank you again, and thank you, Lena, and to DW.
Well, I guess we should be saying thank you for taking this time to really explain exactly what the Unhcr is doing together with these communities. So thanks a lot, Lena and your team for sharing your time with us. I think one key thing I take from this is the importance of these community-based groups, because when people sense that their own local community are involved in making moves to help deal with the situations and the conditions that they are in, then they feel more comfortable to connect. And I think that is very key. I have a couple of questions in relation to that and how the Unhcr team is also really liaising amidst all of these challenges that still members of the community are facing. But we'll get to that during the Q&A. Wanjiku?
Yeah, it was quite interesting to listen to your presentation and to watch these videos because something that stuck for me was that 88% of IDPs are settled within local communities or families. And if that isn't a sign that something is working and working positively, I don't know what is. So it was absolutely amazing to listen to you, Lena and Rebecca, and every other person that was in the video. Now, as we promised before, we are checking our conference up for your questions.
Well, talking about questions, picking up from Wanjiku's last words. Hopefully we have time, Wanjiku and myself, to dig into some of them. But the first question was posted by Luvini Ranasingwe, who says, how do you use feedback mechanisms? When you hear back from the communities, how do you make sure their voices are really listened to? And the communities don't feel frustrated of only just answering questions, but the programs also change accordingly. So that's quite a loaded pack of questions. Lena or anyone can jump on this.
If it's okay with you, Lena, I think I'll start off and you can definitely chime in for, I'm sure I won't give the 100% answer, but yeah, so the beautiful thing about our community-based protection program is that it's kind of flexible and ever changing. And as I hope was clear from our presentation, we really base it off of the community-based protection groups. So, you know, if the community-based protection groups articulate that, you know, this is working or this is not working, then we like alter our programs. And, you know, of course, we're a bit constrained from a year to year basis, but at least, you know, every year we completely reevaluate and rewrite the project. So for example, between 2019 and 2020, these community-based groups and through the complaints or response mechanisms, they expressed that there's really a strong need for more response for survivors of SGBV in certain locations where support wasn't available. So we integrated that into our program for 2020. So we as UNHCR really rely heavily on these, you know, complaints and other the opinions of the communities. And, you know, we try, if it's possible, to change it during the year of the same project. We, you know, try as best as we can. But definitely the next year, we, you know, rework the project to best serve the communities. Another example is in the community-based protection plans and the quick impact projects that Lena explained. Those are completely driven by the community-based structure. So it's for them to say, you know, this is the problem that we're seeing a lot in our community. This is what we need, and this is what we're asking you for money and materials for, basically. So we really are taking their lead. So yeah, that's all I can say. I'll let Lena add anything if she'd like to.
No, thank you. No, I think you responded quite well to it and explained how it worked. And exactly as you said, I think with many of our projects, we already try to include the communities from the beginning, which then also helps to prevent complaints. Of course, there's always complaints, obviously, but by engaging from the beginning and making sure that they're already involved in the design of projects, this helps us prevent getting many complaints afterwards about how this has not, our interventions have not been effective or haven't responded to needs that we're seeing. So even, for example, we work with community-based protection groups also, for example, to identify persons that we are assisting to make sure that it's persons that are proposed by the whole community and that the whole community stands behind the type of assistance that we deliver. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. Luvini, I do hope that you feel the answer was satisfactory for you. And in case not, remember, you can always interact with Lena and Rebecca through our app, okay? So do not be discouraged. And now we get into another question, which asks, how exactly does UNHCR cooperate with radio stations in the context of protection work in Eastern DRC?
Shall I go for it first? So I think we've got to be clear about what we're saying here. On the one hand, we see that community-based protection groups work directly with radio stations. So this is something where the groups directly approach the radio station. They will set up a program together, for example. So, you know, members, experts of the groups, they're coming to the radio station. They, for example, they do Q&As. That's a format that we've seen, so that, you know, members from the community can call into the radio station, ask their questions. We also have, you know, there's also the formats of sessions that that the community-based groups are leading. So they're having sort of an expert dialogue where they're passing on information through to the community. There's also other formats where they're just airing small spots. So just like a 10 to 20 second message about, please wash your hands regularly, or please, if you have this or that issue, you can always come to us. We're available here, you can find us there. So this is a way that we see that community-based groups themselves take the initiative. How we as UNHCR are working together with radio stations is in a similar way, actually. So we also, currently we're working, for example, on producing messages about raising awareness on SGBV, how to prevent SGBV, what the rights of survivors of SGBV are, and then we just choose radio stations, we pass them on a message that we've already recorded and that they can then play throughout the day to pass on that information to community members. I'll let Rebecca add maybe, because I know that for refugees, which is a different context than IDPs, but I think for refugees, we also have radio stations that we have started together with them. I'm not sure if Rebecca maybe can tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Lena, and thank you for this question. I just wanted to add back to our community-based protection program for IDPs that we mentioned. We have these kind of quick impact projects with the IDP or the community-based protection groups. And one of those in South Kivu was actually creating a community radio. So that was what they requested as their project. So they, you know, that was their initiative. That was what they thought would respond to the most pertinent protection needs in their area. So that was what we supported in 2019. So that, you know, radio is ongoing. So that was a really cool example of using radio. Yeah, as Lena said, for the refugees, there have been refugee radio stations set up, not directly by UNHCR, but by other humanitarian actors. But we in general use the radio and community radio specifically as a tool to communicate with refugees, for example, around COVID-19 prevention measures, when there's something like World Refugee Day or World Humanitarian Day, things like that. We use the radio as a tool to kind of get our message across and, you know, remind the individuals that we support, like that UNHCR is here, like here are your rights, here are, you know, here's assistance that we're hoping to provide, you know, in support of the DRC government. So yeah, it's a really big tool for us.
Okay, now for those of you still tuned in, you know, you still have the chance to ask any question on your mind, because our presenters are here to answer anything. Talking about questions still, I have a couple of them. I'll start with this one. So you mentioned, and I'm not in any way trying to belittle people internally displaced, but trying to put myself into their shoes. They are facing so many different challenges. You know, you're internally displaced. You're already thinking about a lot. Then there's also a pandemic that you have to deal with. You have to think about what you're even eating every day, and your family and all your loved ones. How does the UNHCR decide the best way to approach dealing with such people, especially during the pandemic? What is the priority? What helps you decide your next course of action?
I guess I can start, Lena, if that's okay. So I think, I mean, our presentation is kind of an answer to that question, in that we really rely on the community. So it's not for UNHCR to say like, oh, this is the biggest need. It's for the communities to tell us what they need or what their priorities are. So, you know, of course, we think about essential services such as like medical assistance, food assistance, but, you know, at times what I may think as an American living in DRC is not correct. So we really rely on, you know, what the community-based groups are telling us. So for example, you know, in one place where we might think that, and this is just not a real example. So for example, if we think, you know, food is the biggest problem, they'll tell us actually, no, it's the fact that schools are closed and children don't have, you know, don't have anything to do. And we're seeing cases of sexual and based violence against children. That's the biggest issue right now. So I guess, you know, I can't give you a really concrete answer, except that we really rely on the community-based groups to tell us what they need and want. And that's kind of, during our presentation, there were some slides about different evaluations that we did with the community-based groups about their needs specifically during COVID-19. And the purpose there was to find out what they want UNHCR to be doing or not doing, what's working, what's not working, etc. So that's really how we try to work on our response to IDPs in their host community.
Okay, Lena, if you have any top up.
Yes, if I may, I mean, I fully agree with Rebecca's explanation. I just wanted to add, you know, another very important aspect that plays into it is also managing expectations of communities, because, you know, we as UNHCR, we can only do so much. So we're there to listen, to really understand and analyze the problem, but we also often refer to other actors. You know, we have certain areas in which we as UNHCR can intervene, but for example, we're not medical experts for internally displaced persons. So this is something where, you know, a lot of the times what we're also doing is to just check with other humanitarian actors saying, hey, we have seen that there is a need for this or that. The community tells us they want this or that. Can you, with your expertise and with your capacities, help in that regard? So it's not UNHCR doing it all on our own. And I think it's always very important to tell communities what is feasible, what is not feasible. And I think that's also links really back to communications and how communication is a two-way road. Like, yes, we're listening, and listening is super important, but we're also responding, and we sometimes it is better to be transparent and explain what cannot be done, why it cannot be done, what the difficulties are, rather than just make empty promises or not explain at all. So I think that's just a very important aspect as well that needs to be mentioned.
Okay.
I actually do have a follow-up question because Lena, you've finished on a very good point about transparency. And something that was mentioned during the presentation was that communities are not yet ready to deal with COVID-19 on their own. They do want you to step in as UNHCR to step in and help them. And as the presentation was going on, what I missed, and this is where the transparency on just a communication basis comes in, was I couldn't understand what, I mean, I can deduce why, but I couldn't understand the reason for the community to decide or to say, hey, we just want you to help us. Perhaps you can expound a bit more on that situation and how that also either adds to your challenges, the fact that they want you there, or helps your work in the community. Either of you could take the question.
Shall I start, and then I'll let Rebecca complete and add on to what I'm saying. So I think, first of all, we have to say, you know, COVID-19 really is an exceptional situation. I think it's globally an exceptional situation, but it's also here in the DRC an exceptional situation. And it has added on to what we already consider a humanitarian emergency. So we've already seen that, you know, over 1 million persons have been displaced in 2 provinces just this year alone. So that's like already in a very exceptional situation. So it can be very overwhelming for communities to be dealing with this. And whereas oftentimes protection, you can do a lot by raising awareness and sharing information, COVID-19 also poses a lot of like material needs to which communities with their limited facilities often just cannot respond. We have to see, you know, host communities are already incredibly generous in taking in IDPs and incredibly generous in sharing what often are already restricted resources. So oftentimes, you know, access to clean water already is a challenge. Oftentimes host families live like in food insecurity. So they're already sharing the little that they have with IDPs, but then responding to COVID-19 on top just can be very overwhelming. So for example, you know, if access to water already is difficult, having even more access to water for hand washing as is necessary for COVID-19 can be a big challenge. Having access to soap is a challenge. Being able to afford masks, all those are things that are material needs that simply cost money, that require resources that communities often just don't have. And this is where they want us to step in. They also have limited access to information. So another important part was also that we're handing them reliable information before they then can pass on that reliable information on COVID-19 to their communities. And I think especially in the beginning of the crisis, this has really been a big challenge. Overall, I think for us, it's a positive sign that communities do request our assistance still at the moment. It's just always a balance of them not being dependent on us. But of course, we're here to give assistance. And I think that's the great thing about the community-based approach. We support, but they're not dependent on us and we're not imposing. So I think that would be from my side. I hope this answered your question. I'll hand over to Rebecca for any additions.
Yes, you have answered my question,
Thank you for the question,
Rebecca.
and thank you, Lena. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, Lena pretty much covered everything. I was just going to emphasize that, you know, with COVID response, there's a lot of material needs. The health zones, you know, they may in certain areas not necessarily have the equipment or the staffing necessary. So for example, in one case, we gave a donation of motorbikes to help COVID-19 contact tracing and referrals and things like that. So there are kind of like very specific things that require resources that host communities that are already kind of strapped for resources and are affected by conflict are even more affected by when they're hosting large numbers of IDPs. So yeah, exactly what Lena said, just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you so much for your responses, Eddie. I'm sure you would have more questions, as do I. However, our time is slowly coming to an end for today's session. Remember, this kind of sessions, insightful discussions will continue throughout the week. And we hope that everyone who's asked a question has been answered so far. Remember, you still have a chance to follow up on the conference app. But for now, let's take a look at tomorrow's program. We will have representatives of two community media with us, Kamji in Lebanon and Sikika in Kenya.
Well, both organizations shifted their strategies towards information related to COVID-19, and they will share their experience of helping refugees to navigate the pandemic. We'll be joined by the community reporters from Kakuma refugee camp and Shatila themselves and get first-hand experience from the field. So Wanjiku, you and myself and everybody tuned in, it's something you don't want to miss.
Definitely not. And I want to say a special thank you to Lena and Rebecca and each of the participants of today's session. Thank you so much for being with us. Now you know what you can expect from tomorrow. That's it from us. My name is Wanjiku Maura.
And I am Eddie Micah Jr. We'll be right here, same place, and of course the time remains the same. And yeah, for all that you need to know, I am Eddie Micah Jr. Goodbye.